my hope is that today we will go through several documents that we've got from interested parties. We have Mr. Poor's presentation from yesterday, scope of work and our draft RFP for what the department's doing. And Mr. Sterling has put together a document that lists sort of a side-by-side of interest of Rev and other folks. And then we have our own thoughts here in committee, and the overall shape of where I hope we're going is that next year we'll revisit the res and we'll have a much better data set to do that work with, and that set of data will be what the department's doing and what we could request through an RFP put out through JFO. And I'm back to using my hands again. It's like two sets of complementary data that add up to a completer picture. I know that earlier on we were talking about doing legislation to make some changes, and since we have more questions than answers at this point, it seems like a good time to slow down, get the data, and do the work next January. So with that,
Mr. Chair,
yeah.
can I just ask
Yeah.
what the House, if there's a conversation on what the House is doing in relation to what we're doing?
Sure. I talked to Representative Sibilia last night, and they're looking at, they're obviously interested in the same topic. I think they're having a day of testimony today.
Okay.
And I think they're hoping that in one fell swoop, they'll have something to put in bill form.
Okay.
So we'll see, I figure we should stick to our own knitting, get ours done, and then we'll do some sort of reconciliation between two different ways of going at the same question.
So would we be moving a bill out of this committee then? And
I would think we want to tee something up so that we could. I don't honestly know exactly what the best, given the limited number of days. One for us as a regular full-time committee, but really I'm looking at from here through next Friday if we're really going to be adjourning or close to adjourning on the 12th. Make sure that something travels in time. For either side, even if we were totally in agreement, we're just concurring. There's still days that get consumed. We notice, vote, lay. There's 3 days at a minimum. So we need to be kind. And I don't know what their version will be. I mean, I did talk to Representative Sibilia. She had ideas, but I don't think their whole committee has sat down and had a res day yet. So that's today up there, as far as I understand. Okay, so I thought maybe the place to start was this side by side, and maybe we can mark such as something along the lines of a top priority and maybe sort of would like to see, and we could just winnow things out and get a shorter list. By the way, Mr. Poor, I don't know if you said it while you were here. So Vermont greenhouse gas inventory came out yesterday.
oh,
And then there's also a link to that Dunsky report from Mr. Sterling. His people want
I'm
weekend reading.
happy to ask Tony to print copies. I'm gonna ask him for myself.
I can ask.
Oh, thank you, Jude. I would love a copy of both of those.
Anybody else?
Yes, I
All right.
Sarah McDonald, do you want a copy
I
of?
would have done more, but I thought you were more digital.
Sorry.
Oriented.
Senator, would you like any?
I'm sorry, in another world.
Yeah, I know.
We have 2 reports that we talked about yesterday. Would you like a copy?
Yes, please.
So I think,
Great.
thanks. All right, so anyway, that's that. Now, I just wanted to get out one piece of paper, because we do have more than one version of things around. I mean, does that make sense?
Yes.
I'm totally open to another process. I'm just trying to figure a way to push ourselves along. So yeah. Starting with the tall things, well, let's see. There. How about we start on the side that says 230107 version 71 in the upper left. Study structure, so.
Are you on yesterday's or today's?
Today's, I think.
Oh, we have a new one
Yeah,
of these?
new one.
Oh, I don't have the new one. It's changed from portrait to,
Version control is always. I don't think there's a date on it.
No, there isn't, so you might want to write one on there.
The newer version has the landscape page has some metrics added under the GPS box, as well as some scenarios on the.
Looks like it's the same.
Yeah, thank you. Great. Thank you, everybody. And thanks so much, Mr. Dowd and Mr. Sterling, for putting it together. So if we start on the portrait side, study structure. So again, figure we're not making all this stuff that we're talking about in an earlier draft ago. Alternate metering, setting a 100% goal. But it doesn't seem like a point to go there at this point until we have more data. So no hard changes, really study only. But in terms of what we would want to get to, it would be, I think, helpful to put both 20 and 30% in. The year 2032, I mean, we haven't talked about this one much lately. The VIPSA members have 2032, not 2030. So I don't know if you all have any thoughts about that one, but the other thing that, from my point of view, is I would love to have stuck to 2030, but we also, this is the 5th year running towards reconfiguring, and we're getting closer and closer to 2030. So it seems like we're creating a more and more disruptive plan if we say you need to hit it in only 5 years or 6 years as opposed to. Open to change. So distribution utilities, they have just 20, and my thought was that rather than just name a single target, some people like to go bigger. Why not do scenarios for both 20 and 30? We all set on that. Environmental coalition, they're set by 2030. Yeah, so they're on a little more, whatever, faster pace, faster track. And there's also this new category, new regional renewables. So
Tier 1A.
yeah, the tier 1A concept. Yeah. So I figured today's gonna be a great conversation.
Yeah, okay.
And so Mr. Sterling, Mr. Port, if we're chatting about something, why don't we just put, introduce yourself the first time, and then we'll turn it into more of a conversation so that we can make more progress more fast. And
Yeah,
I didn't think you were too loud. I don't know. You were so quiet yesterday. I wasn't sure if you were just listening or
who do you?
jump in whenever you like.
Oh, yes. Yeah, there we go.
So just a question
Yeah.
about the new regional renewables. When we say regional here, I just want to make sure, it's clarity, it's a good thing. Are we talking about New England? Or are we talking about Vermont? Or either?
North America.
Yeah. Sure. Well,
Who's that
This is
question
a-
directly?
it's at it's under
That's-
the
that's
Environmental Coalition,
The chair when I what region?
Oh, hi.
New England,
Peter Sterling, Renewable
Vermont.
Energy Vermont. I also like to introduce Jonathan Dowd, the deputy director that does a lot of great analysis that. Yes, we were talking about in the region, in ISO New England region.
So New England, in the ISO New England, not specifically necessarily Vermont.
Correct.
Where you-
ISO New England.
Where are you seeing regional under environmental coalition?
It's under the third row of environmental
Oh,
coalition.
you're on. Oh,
Yeah, on the portrait side.
And so is that a shared definition? I mean, just so that we stay in sync, does the department recognize ISO-based assets versus out of ISO assets? Do you treat them any differently? Do you plan around them any differently?
So. TJ Core, Department of Public Service.
Thank you.
Remember who I was for a second. So ISO New England treats those resources similarly. If there's a 500 megawatt project in the region, or like an offshore wind plant or an imported transmission line, they treat kind of the reliability analysis and transmission analysis identically. In terms of how we think about it, and when I think about a new regional, I have thought about it being located within the New England region, but I think there is, for instance, there's a transmission lines proposed to come in, that would provide a range of benefits and costs to Vermonters in the region, and how that plays into kind of what might be available and what might impact our portfolio going forward is really important. So I know I'm waffling a little bit there, but when I think of encouraging new renewable development, I usually think of in the ISO region. But if there's an import into the region, I mean, if there's a new wind plant in Plattsburgh that we could import into New England and was set up to do that, does that continue to further our goals and track? So, and then you got to take it to the next step and ask that question of something that's bigger in Canada.
Yeah.
So I'm not, I recognize I'm not giving you a definitive answer here, but that's how I think about it.
So is this I've lost track of the names because they were floated out and then they all seem to become dormant. There was a underwater cable, DC cable, I forget how big, 1,000 megawatt or something like that, like coming down the lake, pops out of the lake. There's two versions. I think one came out around Harrisburg, another one came out at the bottom of the lake.
New England Clean Power.
The one was headed to the New Haven substation, the other is headed to the Ludlow substation, Cavendish.
So the New England Clean Power Link, as Mr. Servant said, is the one that is currently a little more active, I guess I would say, that has, with the building infrastructure law in place, there's a lot of opportunities for transmission facilitation, and they've applied for funding in there. And that project is already permitted. So that the difference between that project and any others that you hear about is that one has a permit from the Public Utilities Commission
And that one's the one that lays at Ludlow or the one that,
in Ludlow, and it's 1,000 megawatts.
so. You're right, it injects into the Velco system there, or would,
Correct.
and you would have access to power from that.
We
or
may
not.
be,
We may or may not.
so I think just like any other entity in New England,
Yeah.
our utilities could negotiate for the power from that line. And so there's different, advantages different utilities have in different states by the way they're structured, and I'm happy to go into that, but if necessary, but it's not guaranteed that we would get power from that.
And do we know what kind of power it's going to be transmitting at this point, or it's just building the highway? We're not sure who's going to get on it.
Yeah, the developer is really is a transmission developer, and it is building the highway. They have partnerships, I believe, with subject to check. 5 years ago, I believe their partnership was Hydro-Quebec. That could have changed.
Contracts with that.
Well, they have a partnership. They have contracts to. It's not necessarily they could deliver power from any entity up there into Vermont. So it could be from Newfoundland, it could be from New Brunswick, and like wheels through Quebec.
They have opportunities up there.
Yes.
Thanks. Just want to understand what's happening out there. Right, and then the next block down is DPS. Looking, so you've got, well, for one thing, you have your own stakeholder working group and study going on. And as we're saying, I think we're trying to understand what's in that, and also talk with you if there's something that is a good fit for your study, that see if the department might be willing to make changes and add a scenario or something like that, whatever we end up getting to. So yours is 20, 30, tier 1. So we get into the other thing. Right now, I've learned to hear the voice of Senator Watson whenever I see these words. Then we have the as renewable as well as by clean. Are you investigating both categories?
Yes.
And distinguishing one from another, you're reporting out?
Yes, and one thing I think that I haven't made clear, I realized yesterday, is that when we talk about the 100% clean category, I think there's no thought, hasn't been a thought in my mind that we would take away the 75% renewable underneath that, if that makes sense. So it wouldn't just be like, okay, we no longer have 75% renewable, it would be nested in.
Okay.
And the specific number could be modified also.
Sure. So for me, I'm writing down, instead of clean, I'm writing carbon free. That's the way you use it. And then we get into a category of discussion about what is truly carbon free. I suppose just to put it on the table, that includes things like, I don't know if nuclear, biomass. For the time being, you're not remembering this off the top of my head. For the time being, carbon free includes nuclear and large scale biomass, like McNeil or Rygate.
Correct. Yep. And large scale hydro also.
Which is also in renewable right now.
Correct.
By statute, not by science.
That happens a lot around. There was it.
Thank you. So for most of these, I feel like I can understand, why, like I think I'm understanding what the differences are between the different lines. I am not understanding what is meant differently between 100% tier 1 and 20% or 30% tier 2 by 2032. And the next line, 100% clean and 20% or 30% tier 2. Like those, can you help me understand how those are different?
I think the main difference is really nuclear in there.
So, but you right, so tier 1 does not otherwise include nuclear.
Correct.
Okay, that, okay, thank you.
And then the next line down I think is unspecified percent of new regional / imported renewables. So when you think about that, why is it important to distinguish in region versus out of region power? Is it
Really, it's I think it's been a discussion that's been ongoing, and I think it's really important to suss out what the differences are in the study. So, I think there are issues, there have been raised concerns with imported power from Canada. And so if we need to address that head on and kind of really suss out what those differences are and how important they are to Vermont.
okay? And so just to be more specific, so I get it, and I can relate, there's controversy around HQ power. So, and particularly if it's not just existing, but if they were to expand their facilities in order, and that might include the kind of environmental issues would be raised again if they were flooding the land, etc. Is that the controversy that the department's kind of acknowledging underneath, that there'll be, public will have a position, may take a position, or have interests?
Yes, yeah, that's absolutely it. And then there could be a preference for power more locally.
Mr. Sterling.
Thanks. To build on what TJ said, this is right. One of the reasons to differentiate between in-region power and not, and he is totally right about if there's a wind farm in northern New York that may very well meet our needs. That's great. I get it. The sticking point, at least for REV, most environmental groups, is when we allow RECs separate from energy purchases from Hydro-Quebec to meet our REVs. I mean, our REV is on record, and I really believe Hydro-Quebec is a really important part of our baseload energy. We need Hydro-Quebec. Without Hydro-Quebec, we would be using natural gas and nuclear more, and that's really going to be bad. But what the sticking point is, because no other RPS in New England allows out-of-region renewables to be counted as out-of-region hydro to be counted, large hydro to be counted as renewable, we backfill our REVs with HQ REVs that are very cheap, and then we take our REVs and sell them to other states, and that's arbitrage. And there was a legitimate reason that the REVs in 2015 did that. It generated a lot of money. It kept rates down and helped work the industry. Like, I guess at the time, right now, it's basically greenwashing. So that's one of the reasons to differentiate, at least in the purpose of unbundled REV purchases from out of the region for large hydro specifically.
So is it, are there two issues in here? Just to keep them, I don't want to conflate them. There's the separability of RECs and just purchasing large scale hydro RECs alone and treating them as eligible for meeting our RPS, our IS.
Right, like the bundled RECs from HQ are not the problem. No one's saying that's a bad thing, at least right now. No one's saying that.
And are other states allowing the use of unbundled RECs of any sort and or including HQ power or large scale hydro?
Yes. Some you do it from in region in Massachusetts, and I'm not an expert on all this. Massachusetts has a separate thing called a clean energy standard. And that clean energy standard, which is separate from the RPS, they do allow the retirement of unbundled RECs from large region hydro with HQ to satisfy that requirement. We don't have a clean energy standard. We have RPS, and that's
yeah. Can I just add to that? I think that is right, and Massachusetts separates the clean energy standard and their renewable portfolio standard. effectively, that's what tier one does. So we just call it a renewable portfolio standard, but effectively, tier one is what Massachusetts is doing there, right? So Massachusetts has a clean energy standard and an RPS. In Vermont, that's kind of all bundled in our renewable energy standard. So when we draw that distinction of, hey, no other states do this in the RPS, well, it's only because we call it, we do it in the RPS and state, but Massachusetts calls it something else. It's kind of to me, that's an artificial distinction.
Sure.
I do agree, though, to the bigger point that there are two issues that it's, and both Mr. Sterling and I identified them that we want to address. And it is kind of the imported power generally and the unbundled recs.
Should I be calling you Mr. Ford? Because I feel bad. I've been calling you TJ. the last 20 minutes. You want Mr. Sterling.
He
I
likes,
don't know how-
he likes Mr. He
You want me
likes
to
to
do
do
Mr. I do there, but Mr. I feel bad.
I just hold you in such high regard.
There you go.
I love.
I'll go with Mr. Ford.
It's
That's
a little,
apologize.
it's a little formal, but it puts everyone on the same footing. It bothers you from day one to be in the legislature and have guests to committees refer to representatives and senators by
That's different.
title.
Yeah.
And then, but they were, then
Okay.
members of committees might say, Fred, how you doing? And that was the person in the chair, and Fred happened to be the secretary, so it always seemed a little like when you went to approach and they had a short chair at the end of the table, I felt like everyone was getting a short chair. Anyway, so, okay, so it's not a problem when the power still has its recs attached, then no unbundled. It could be, I mean,
No.
and I also wanted to sort of back up and kind of just remind myself and make sure I'm thinking of this right, that the reason RECs got created in the first place that was that renewables compared to non-renewables were more expensive. So in a way, it was a way to subsidize their purchase and help create the industry and make them more competitive in the marketplace. And so before sort of getting lost in all these weeds, I just want to think like, okay, so how are we steering money and what's that increment, the cost of a rec doing for us anymore? If it's just buying an existing resource, then I don't know if it's helping, and change the overall portfolio for Vermont. So sorry, Senator White.
Oh, no, and I also think Senator Watson had a question for me.
Do.
Go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Well, so I just want to check my thinking, make sure I'm thinking about this correctly. Tier one is more or less synonymous with potentially unbundled recs.
So no,
Okay.
so not just tier one.
Okay.
And you can have tier one recs that are bundled also.
Right,
into
yes,
tier one.
but you could have,
Right, but also many of the recs that are used to meet tier two are unbundled. And so,
okay.
Yeah, unbundled.
It's not
is
correlated
not
with
the
either.
problem, right? If it's an unbundled rec from like a new resource, we like that, because that's
Sure.
encouraging more
Sure,
renewables come
sure.
online.
Yeah.
A bundled rec from HQ, which is tier one, that's not
That's
bad because that's a renewable resource we
Right.
really need.
Yeah.
It's when it's unbundled from this large out of region thing that's depressing the rec prices that we backfill for other requirements, because if we didn't have that large amount of recs retired, we would be either buying ones from other new resources
Mhm.
or building more in here so we can retire. And that's what we want, to get carbon out of the atmosphere. So
Right.
it's not unbundled per se.
But we don't see the arbitrage happening in tier two. Okay.
right, because the price is largely is the same in Vermont
Oh.
and in Massachusetts. And so
Okay.
it kind of follows the higher price. If there was a tier two resource that you could build And you got a higher value for selling those RECs in Massachusetts, the utility would be encouraged to do that because it would be part of their least cost planning.
Gotcha, okay.
It's clear as mud.
Getting there. Thank you.
This thing just sort of drives me crazy because we're talking about buying and selling stuff. And then we're discounting Confederate money or giving people an opportunity to use monopoly money or Burlington Enterprises used to say, we accept Canadian money at par, which was their way of doing a discount. Canadian wasn't on the international trade, it wasn't worth $1 at the time, but they were treated like it was $1 and get discounts. And we play all these games instead of saying what the value of money is. We give a wink and a nod here and there, and then we go, the wink and the nod wasn't fair, it undermines our policy, it does whatever. It's too damn clever.
Thank you, Chair Bray. Yeah, I guess I disagree with that characterization, Senator McDonald, and I'm a little concerned about the direction of the conversation because I think it's a little I want to be really clear that our utilities have done nothing wrong at this point. You know, they're
We
acting.
sanction this thing.
Yes, and also there is nothing inherently wrong in general with what they're doing. This is just the creation of a structure that they've been utilizing that has benefited us to keep rates low and to be able to invest in renewable energy. Like that's so and it's not funny money. It's not funny money. It is valuing a resource. And I want to go back to how you described it because I think that there's some core problems with how you described it, although I know you were nodding. I actually think the value of the RECs is not just to be a tradable good, but to actually give what the externality benefit of renewable energy is a value, which is energy. There's energy that is better for the environment and better for our communities and better for the air quality and water quality. And then there's energy that is not. And there is, I think, a value to that. And in part, the REC model was meant to give financial tools to developers and to utilities to invest in this area. But it also was to add a value when in our capitalistic structure right now, unless it's got money associated with it, it doesn't have an inherent value or worth. When we know that there is an inherent value and worth to cleaner air and energy that comes from a local spot. So I do have some uncomfortability with the direction the conversation is taken because RECs are actually something that are a tool. They're neutral in my view. They're not good, they're not bad. It's how you utilize them and how an organization plays by the rules or not. I think what we learned after 2015 and then 2017 was that maybe we don't love when people play the game in the way that they've been playing the game because of how we designed it. So I hope that as we continue to have this conversation, we don't ascribe any like menace to the utilities or to developers who have been actively working in a system.
I don't know if I said something that suggested that. I was saying, to me, it was like, when I go all the way back and I think about why did we create RECs in the first place, is because it was more expensive to buy power that didn't have those negative externalities associated with it.
Yes.
And in order to make it competitive in the marketplace, we added this. We said, oh, well, when you produce power that way, it's going to have, you'll produce the power and you produce the attribute, and we're going to pay you for both. And it'll let them compete.
And I would say that we have lived in a society, especially in the United States, that has subsidized fossil fuel for almost the existence of it as a resource. So this is also the term subsidy. I think I have a little bit of tension with because we have to be really clear about what we have been subsidizing and what low-income communities have been subsidizing with the impacts to having a fossil fuel generating peaker plant in their neighborhood. Like they're subsidizing it on their healthcare costs and they're subsidizing it on their children having health outcomes that are negative compared to our children having health outcomes that are negative. So it does rile me up a little bit, but So I guess I'm just also confused about generally where we're hoping to go with this. And I really appreciate the breakdown of what seems like the different stakeholders want. Are you feeling that we will be drafting a letter to send to the other committee, or kind of what's the next step here?
I'm thinking we'll draft a bill
Oh, okay.
that will create the, that will communicate to the department less formally about, can you include a scenario A and B or something like that? And we were talking about that a little bit yesterday. And then for ourselves, the stuff that's not being done through the department's work, that we would write out what we want to get data on in the JFO study that will be contracted.
Okay. Yeah, I think I'm just struggling because I'm not seeing language, so I'm kind of like not sure. Like, I don't have a lot of questions about what we have here. I do understand what we're talking about. I just feel like the actual what then we are communicating in bill form, I'm not clear on yet, because I felt like we had been, when we had the original bill that had been presented, I thought that there had been kind of an agreement on what would be in there. And then it wasn't necessarily what I thought we were going to end up with. So I'm just trying to track that.
Well, before we go on to write that language, I just thought I wanted to do two things. One, we'll let us all have a better picture of who's interested in what. And then the other thing is, we use terms a little loosely, and so I felt like it was worth slowing down to make sure that we know what we mean by clean versus renewable, in reach and out of reach.
Okay.
No problem with partnership.
Yeah, what does it mean?
Partnership.
Yeah.
So, yeah, subsidy does maybe have a negative connotation to it. Maybe it's recognizing the positive value of environmental attribute. So it would be a more positive way of looking at it. I'll retrain myself.
No, and it's not that you're saying anything inaccurate. It's just I have had a lot of folks who have really closely followed our committee discussion and then used things that we've said against us. Like, we've had videos made of Senator McDonald. And so I just want to be really clear that as we're having these conversations, like, what people are hearing might be not what is accurate to the situation. So I just always want to make sure that we have on the record kind of that alternative, because we've had a lot of fossil fuel dealers and corporations who have combed through our meetings and have tried to find information to use against us. So I'm just really cognizant of that today.
Well, I think there'll always be spin doctors outside the room that unfairly sample what we do and use it for their own purposes. So I figure in here we can just concentrate on doing our best work and let other people talk about it. I'm less sensitive to that.
Get a thicker skin.
Okay, so we're almost at the end of the page. RES compliance on a sub-annual level. So we talked about that yesterday. Do you true up whether you have the recs you need on just an annual basis, or do you true up more frequently during the course of a year? Is that what that one's referring to?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. And then others as identified by stakeholders. So I don't know if we have that many stakeholder scenarios. Then I was just going to put to the other side and keep on cruising. Cost and benefit categories. So our own earlier draft had full life cycle analysis of costs and benefits of studying scenarios considering increased revenues to municipalities and state, increased revenues from job creation. We also talked about the value of generation close to load. So the locational value, that in my list, revenues to municipality and state. The REMI stuff that we were talking about yesterday, I think would be part of general modeling. GDP, basically GDP modeling. The other thing we've talked about a lot was associated storage, the value of associated storage with generation. have the sense I'm leaving something out.
No, I mean,
But-
storage is really the one that we.
Generation close to load storage, I think those were the two main things, and then there's just an economic multiplier effect by doing development and creating infrastructure in the state. This DUs, I'm in the DU count, so increase those net impact on jobs, so actually that's sort of captured, that will be captured in the REMI edit, change in electric retail rates and impacts, so, yeah, that would be, are you doing, is the department doing rate impact analysis?
So, I think rate impact analysis isn't that far of a stretch to do. We probably would do that. We would, you know, if there's a impact on the net revenues of a utility, right, positive or negative, then you kind of can just apply that to your projection of revenues for the utility going forward. I actually am not sure if it's explicit in the scope as it is now, but we talk about cost effectiveness to Vermont. I think that's part of it. You can translate that into.
Okay, is it something that we should, I guess, you know, in terms of who's gonna take it, it would certainly be something we'd wanna know. So if it's not a department thing, then I think it should be in ours.
I would say that we would put it in there.
Okay, so
Relatively easy.
Grid upgrade expenses. We talked about that in sort of the inverse. We said location generation close to load has decreases the need for transmission and distribution upgrades, or can. But I don't know if there's another side of that. If we're bringing in more power from further away, like regional power, if we're gonna have to see transmission and distribution upgrades for that. Do you know if this cuts both ways?
Yeah, I think time and locational value is a phrase you hear a lot in the energy plan, you read a lot in the energy plan. And that would be something that would be included in the T&D net impacts. And there's, you know, sometimes that's a hard thing to know on a granular basis. You know, for the most part, if it's a rooftop net metering, that's going to have that locational value. You know, something that gets bigger, a community array or a utility scale array, it could have value and it could have costs. And so it kind of depends on that.
Should we?
Sorry, T&D first.
Oh, sorry, transmission and distribution.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Thank you.
So grid upgrade expenses, is that something that you are already anticipating doing, or that we would be putting in our bucket?
I would anticipate that's part of the, part of the analysis of the impacts in our study.
In your shop, okay, thank you. Effectiveness of distributed generation, reducing carbon intensity. Additional effectiveness of additional distributed generation that reducing carbon intensity. I'm not sure what that one is saying exactly.
That just means like micro, are you talking like microgrid? Is that, and like
No.
local
Sorry,
generation?
Where are you looking here?
The DU column on the landscape page.
Okay, sorry.
No, don't worry about it.
So I didn't write that one. It's in the DU proposal. So I am not sure exactly what they are talking about, but I can.
Jonathan Down, Renewable Energy Vermont. This is my note from the DU's proposal. And they had a couple items where they were specifically looking at the relative benefits of distributed generation versus larger forms of renewables. So this bullet and the next one are both related to comparing distributed generation versus other renewables. They'd like to do that both on cost and on carbon intensity reduction effectiveness.
Okay, I'm trying to think of how to turn that into the question to be answered. I'm struggling.
So in the study, as we started to scope it out, I think a lot of that will be illuminated by the differences in scenarios of different impacts of tier 2, that local generation, and then the estimate of a new regional tier of generation. And so we intend to have the carbon impacts, to analyze the emissions impacts of these different scenarios. Will be looked at the word carbon intensity, just that turns into a factor of emissions versus megawatt hours. And so I think that would be captured with our study. And I'm happy to flesh that out more to make sure
Okay,
that
so
I'm right.
how about, I'll mark it down as part of your study, but anyone who's an interested party, maybe on the DU side, that is bringing this forward, if you can speak to Mr. Port and us, so we all know what we're actually signing up for. On that one, that would be helpful.
I do just want to make clear, as we talk about carbon, the outside of the scope of the study is emissions factors for carbon. We're going to use, emissions factors from, currently available information. We're not going to create our own emissions factors here. And I think there's two ways there's at least two ways to look at it. There's how the greenhouse gas inventory captures emissions. There's kind of the marginal emissions from like a natural gas plant. If you turn on a light or turn off a light, what is meeting that need or not meeting that need. And then there's a life cycle basis. Right now, we have not proposed to do any life cycle accounting here, but if the ANR study on life cycle analysis through the Climate Council comes up with emissions factors, presumably as a follow-on to the study, that those could be just applied as different factors.
Okay. And Ms. Chakowski, good morning. Thanks for joining us. So we're on the landscape side of the page, and we're divvying up items to be studied either through what the department's already doing or what we would do through a contract to be led by Jay. The next one is modification/establishment of procurement programs and modified definition of distributed generation. So I'm wondering if that refers to, for instance, we've talked about it as maybe there will be a standard office 2.0 or something like that. Are you thinking about looking at different procurement programs? We talked a little bit yesterday about that metering, standard offer, PPAs.
I think this is one, so yes, generally, maybe that this turns into another scenario. This is one that the devil's really details here on terms of, okay, we're going to modify the net metering program. Well, what exactly are what are the costs of that going to be? Well, it depends on the details. Are you going to, change the cap of the size threshold? Are you going to build a different community solar program? What does that program look like, and how are those benefits distributed to different portions of the state? And so, I think this whole process, the public engagement, the technical analysis, and then ultimately a building of recommendations needs to address that. Is it specifically in the technical analysis? Maybe if a scenario can be built that it's clear enough that can give results that people have confidence in.
Sure. I mean, I think one of the ones that's the most regularly controversial is the value of net metering. what should be paid and what the values are related to it. It's been batted back and forth every year for several years running without sort of a Dunsky level report like we saw yesterday. And I'm wondering if that's something that we should be putting into the JFO contract. Feels like it, but I don't know if that would come up necessarily what you were already planning to do.
So I think that, as I mentioned yesterday, in developing the scenarios of distributed generation, they're likely to be different size categories, just generally, whether it's rooftop or I don't know what the threshold will be, but
Yeah.
I mean, 500 kilowatts or 3 megawatts. And, you know, there'll need to be some assumptions on how the tier 2 will be met. And necessarily, as part of the analysis, the value of those different resources will have to come into play in estimating the impact societally to Vermonters and customers. And so it will necessarily be part of the study. And pulling it out in a chart like Dunsky had, I think you know, you have to stack those values in order to come up with a overall impact estimate anyway. So,
Yeah. Okay. So I've written down as, I don't want to see it stuck on defining exactly what those scenarios are, but I've written down net metering, standard offer, whatever, 2.0, power purchase agreements, and community solar. Leaving out anything that an attribute, plant type that we might want to look at. Mr. Sterling.
Hi. One quick thing, I know I said this the first time I testified, but I want to say again, as Senator White says, people recording this are one of the meetings out of context. I 100% want to agree with what Senator White said. Our utilities are doing nothing wrong. They are obeying the law as written. They're not even going around one anyway. They're doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing under the law, and it's not unethical in any way. I think the conversation I'm having is we want to change the law in order to move forward to get more greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere, but I don't want it to come out that red utilities are not paying by the rules. That's not.
Okay.
Can I just talk about you know, in this conversation you're going on here about the study and you're doing talking about a lot of really good things, and one of the concerns I brought up yesterday was what assumptions are being used behind like the transmission and distribution impacts. And you know, there's a lot of leeway. And when Mr. Poor, you know, brought up this really good Berkeley lab slide yesterday about what he wants to study in the RPS, just looking at broader societal impacts. And I'm not saying the department's going to do this, but the range of cost options, just in that one category of the 6 on this list, is $46 a megawatt hour to $201 a megawatt hour for the human health impacts, carbon emissions, and all that stuff, right? Where the department lands on that spectrum is very important. I'm not saying anything bad is going to happen, but if someone making a choice, where do you land between $46 and $201? The other example I'll give is when we talk about transmission distribution, you know, what are the assumptions for things like heat pump adoption or EV adoption that are going to be factored into what kind of grid we want? And here's a very specific example for one of my members. When they were doing this work in another state, they got the state analysis of what they want the load to look like. And the thing that they looked at for EVs was everybody who bought an EV between now and 2030 was buying a compact EV. Now, as Senator McDonald will often talk about, the rolling man caves, his 4-seater trucks, that's one of your best quotes, is not everyone's going to buy a compact EV. People are going to buy bigger trucks. And so he was able, you know, to get into that and say, well, we need to adjust our load estimate. You know, like just saying there's a lot of assumption in all of this that someone has to make, and you know, that's what we're trying to better understand. Not saying that is happening. I just want to understand better in all of these lines what the assumptions are.
Okay, that's just an important thing. And maybe one way to address it without having the study become encyclopedic is like low, medium, high, you know, game out scenarios. We do that. I've seen that. We do this other times. That way, if the adoption rate is high, well, we've at least got a figure associated with it. If it's low, then we have an idea of where it will be. that how, Mr. Ford, you know, you generally are planning to do it, like name the assumption, but include like a low and a high figure?
So yes, but not for every assumption. So because you could have, you know, infinite number
Yeah.
of scenarios, right? So I think this is part of the process when we talk about, in that scope, having kind of input into the assumptions. For example, the default assumption that we would use is the social cost of carbon. I don't know what that turns into for $1 per megawatt hour, but it's, you know, as the council adopted it, it was $128 a ton for carbon. And I think they're actually talking about potentially increasing it because of new information, which that's great. Whatever, because I feel like there's a value there that we can use. Now we can talk about doing a sensitivity on that, but we should think about what the value of that is versus other sensitivities, whether we have a different electric load forecast or a different whatever forecast.
Sure. So how do you manage it? So you may have some sort of combinatory explosion, like.
Good. I think this is going to be an interesting process, because I think there's going to be a lot of views, and what would the way I envision this is that we have the contractor and have some discussions where we say, hey, here are what we think are the key assumptions, social cost of carbon, we, you know, and present that to stakeholders. You know, when we have draft results, say, hey, you know what, we found that this other variable actually really impacted the outcome here. And so we want to highlight that, and then we'll see if we can test it. I am already worried about the scope of this.
Yeah.
And you said encyclopedic, it's a big scope, and there, at some point, there are going to have to be limitations on what we can realistically accomplish with both time and money.
Well, I think one thing, I don't know if we can bracket things with like high, medium, low, or high, low, or that could be without maybe bogging it down too much. And then I think from what you just said, if key assumptions were listed and discussed briefly, and maybe you lay out what the high and lows are for those things, at least when people then would read through the report, they know what was underneath it. We know, we'd be able to interpret or ask questions of the report or explore it without having to review things. Is that something you usually go into, you know?
That's the type of thing that the process that's laid out in the scope envisions.
Yeah, okay.
Exactly that.
And I think we should adopt the same thing for anything we ask you for. If something explicit in bracket, estimates, things like that. Okay, thank you. And then other study notes, same as 23-0107. So consider co-location of load, generation and storage, independent control, utility control. I don't know if large storage is ever managed independently by the owner, or it's always, I suppose you could do it by PPA to a utility, or you could just say, we're building it and we're gonna let the utility manage it. So maybe both those need to be distinguished. I don't know. Do you know the answer to that? Or does anyone on the utility side have anything to say about that one?
I guess not.
On whether it's independent control or utility control?
Yeah, I just don't know that market at all. And if we need to just say anything about storage, if it's like a business opportunity that someone's going to sell that storage to someone, or they're gonna build the asset and then the utility will manage it because they're gonna be using it for load management, et cetera. Senator White and then Mr. Knapp.
Okay, I think the question that I would have from your question is, I'm not aware of any battery storage right now, other than maybe your off-grid friend with some batteries that anyone but a utility is doing. I believe the only storage we have right now in the grid is through utilities or utility managed. And maybe I'm
So, largely that's correct, but there are two storage proposals that are put into the ISO New England queue for interconnection
Oh,
of two in Vermont over 100 megawatts.
wow.
And so do those, well, you know, there's a lot of things that are put in the ISO New England queue, to be fair, that don't ever get built. That all of those transmission projects we talked about have been in the queue for several years, but so there are entities thinking about it, but I just did want to clarify that they are thinking about it. And I think for the most part, there's generally more value to have the utility control. As part of our study, I don't think we would distinguish over that, and we would just be thinking about, you know, to the extent storage is there, how it would be packaged in Vermont, kind of assuming that it was operated to meet Vermont's needs.
Okay. So I'm looking back at our own column, stuff that I'm sort of adding back in. I don't know that we've said anywhere else what we have talked about, but not quantified in any way, value, you know, a resilience value. Like that one's always hard. We talk about it, but we don't often quantify it. We're looking for a more resilient grid. I'm not sure always what we mean by that. And I don't know how we assign a dollar value to it. It feels like a buzzword.
Yeah.
Resilience.
Oh, it is a
Like
buzzword.
Yeah.
everyone,
It used to be sustainability and now it's resilience.
So
A spare tire in your car is resilience. Costs money.
right,
I'm gonna use that.
So you wanna buy a car, does it have a spare tire in it or not?
that's a very good example of how we think about it. So we think about reliability as kind of the frequency and duration of outages, and resilience is protecting yourself against like the major outage. So reliability would be kind of getting your tire pressure checked, or you're, you know, or changing your tires. Resilience would be like protecting against like the big blowout. That's what you do in that.
Okay.
Yeah. Quantifying it though
Yeah.
is really challenging.
And sometimes we get ourselves into changes in the law and find out a couple years later, oh, that cost more money than we had expected, or it went to a place that, how did they get that, we seem to be paying them extra money for something, why don't they just charge us for it? We go to a restaurant in some countries and they lay out on the menu what it costs with all the taxes in it, and then other countries, they give you a price, and then when you go to check out, it's bigger than what you bought in the menu. And that's the sort of games that get played around, buying and selling electricity.
All right, so I'm going to move over to the next column, environmental coalition. So analysis of rate and economic impacts, including the social cost of carbon, environmental and EJ impacts for study scenarios. So social cost of carbon is definitely already part of the department, right? And
Yes. it
and
is.
your,
Sorry, I'm trying to concentrate on two things at once here.
I'll wait.
Buyer's premium when you go to an auction.
Okay. The part of the reason you've structured the way you're doing it is that EJ impacts are part of your study. Is that right?
Yeah, to illuminate what, yes.
Yes.
And so what I think of that as is to illuminate impacts to different populations, whether it's siting or cost or health.
And is that in both in-state and out-of-state?
We haven't defined it, so it's
Yeah.
defined broadly here. And you know, So I keep saying yes to the study for a lot of these things, and a lot of these things could be studies in their own right,
Oh, yes.
right?
Oh, yes.
And so, to the extent that we can, I don't know. I don't know exactly how that will happen.
Yeah.
We'll see what the contractors respond with.
Yeah, it's, I'm also having that feeling of like, oh yeah, we're blowing up the scope of your study, and that's not, necessarily realistic for you. And so like, how can we help, And anyway, so I'm trying to keep a list in my head of like, all right, so what might be useful?
Right. And I think we're finding too, a lot of, I'm not the closest to this at the department, but I'm engaged, that just a lot of the understanding of environmental justice impacts is that, one of the problems is we don't have good data on kind of what the baseline is or how to define, we have these general definitions of communities, but we don't have good metrics for what the current baseline is for specific communities. And so even the great energy burden work that has been done in the state is still a little amorphous sometimes on kind of how you define that in different communities in the state, right? And so measuring what will happen in a different scenario against something that's amorphous is challenging.
And I'm noticing in the DPS column right next door, it looks like it's pretty nearly identical. And you've already indicated that social cost of carbon, the only thing that's missing is social cost of carbon, but that's part of your plan of scope of work and plan of work, right?
Correct.
Yeah, so. So for my scorekeeping of what is in your project versus what we haven't covered yet that should be like the JFO contract, I'm just thinking that the top one is addressed. The next one down is the 24/7 rec accounting. That's something that you're covering, and that is in both columns. So apart from that, impact of load management. Can you just say a little bit about how we talking about demand management?
No, so we talked a little bit about this yesterday in terms of load management, and really using the different tools to manage electricity. So it could be on the demand side or the supply side, and using those tools to potentially make modifications to scenarios. So you could imagine a scenario, 30% by 2030, which Mr. Sterling's already indicated that's not anybody's agenda because it's too soon. But if you had a scenario that if that created issues, then you say, okay, let's apply storage to it or other load management tools. So move the supply with storage or manage load.
I get it. Okay, thanks. So either way, but changing the grid mix versus managing load through demand reduction or deferred.
It's what we often call the small print.
The small print. What's the small print?
Small print, and you find out
I
what you haven't read, and you find out later.
Well, but
Or some people know about and use it in commerce, and the others haven't read it.
Next one on the list is on both sides, impact of transmission and distribution investments on avoiding costs given high electrification. Yours says T&D net impacts. I'm not sure if those are synonymous.
Seems like it's these, what are the assumptions? Are we gonna, this might be a, place for a low, medium, high.
I think that makes sense. I mean, if we, even just now, if we have a flat trajectory of load, where, that creates 30 megawatts a year of requirement under our current tier 2 standard. But if we double our load, that doubles that requirement and doubles the amount of in-state generation. And so I agree that this is probably an area.
Yeah.
So avoided cost in this case is referring to what, given title, avoided costs, like environmental impacts, health impacts, what are they avoided, what costs are we avoiding? I'm not sure. Let's hear, speak to that. I mean, it's not, it's in the environmental code, so I don't know if you here able to address, interpret that.
So here, I think the environmental code and department are talking about similar things. It's a matter of points of emphasis and what goes in. So avoiding costs would be deferred or avoided distribution upgrades because you are using power locally.
Yep.
So things of that nature. I think this report would say that the department has that in their study. We just want to make a point of emphasis here that there are distribution level savings that have not been captured in previous analysis. We think those are important. And the high electrification again gets to Peter's point that if we have a whole bunch of heat pumps, we're going to need to be upgrading that infrastructure to support those. We want to make sure we're not double counting those upgrade costs, both as a cost of heat pumps and as a cost of distributed generation.
Mr. Chair, I'm wondering if this section kind of gets at the back and forth we had around if net metering is cost effective or not. And I think that getting like to the conversation we had yesterday about like who's making the report and what the outcomes and assumptions are dependent on the arbiter of the work being done. I would like to see this as a part of the conversation, but I don't necessarily know if I have a strong inclination on like who should be the arbiter of it, because I think my understanding is net metering is a cost savings in part due to what you've described as avoided costs. And the way I had it described to me was it's like a pipe, and when you have water rushing through a pipe at a higher speed, going a greater distance, it takes more maintenance and better piping. And that is less when you have net metering. And maybe I'm going all in. Maybe oh yeah.
Pipe breaks here in the lower parts of the city.
To keep with the thread of the conversation.
No, far too much.
Yeah.
But that's how electricity works on lines, is kind of the descriptor that I've started to understand. So I'm just wondering, are you asking us at this point to decide under this category who would be the folks looking at the avoided costs? And based on kind of what we've divided out already, I think it would automatically be going towards the Public Service Department covering that, or the PUC. So
so I had written a question to myself: should the JFO, amongst however many things we put into the JFO basket, should one of the things that address be procurement?
oh yeah,
And that it could look
I
at,
think they have that.
we have this list,
Yeah.
net metering,
Yeah.
standard offer, PPAs, and community solar. That's 4 things that I've jotted down as we went. I don't want to be duplicative, but I didn't know if those, and if one reason is if we're going to do a deeper dive on that value stack, like what we looked at in the Dunsky report yesterday, is that beyond what department could get into, because it's fairly, has a lot of detail in it, and you're already committed, or that was already part of your work plan? So it's really a question.
On the differences between different procurement strategies.
Yeah.
Is that, so I think that would be, you know, we have it listed, if I'm recalling.
Yeah, it's on here.
As, you know, considerations here, right?
Yeah.
Like the new and modified procurement tools. So I think that is something we want to consider in our work, because, you know, we have a different pathway of meeting our in-state tier. Those are going to come with different costs and benefits. And
Well, I'm noticing that we're actually, I'm highlighting almost every, my color key over here is yellow
Yeah, are
is
you
department,
using?
and then blue is JFO.
Oh, wait.
Yeah. And I have almost everything is yellow so far, so I'm getting a little nervous that we're just always putting everything into your basket, and it may be fine that it's already it's already part of what you're planning to do, you already have the capacity to do it. I'm just a little concerned that we might be, our expectations, we might be overloading the department, and we might have differing expectations about sort of what do we mean by that, at what level of depth can you get into stuff if you have to cover things so broadly.
right, and I definitely a little concerned about that also. There's a lot of things here to cover. I think, you know, generally there's kind of the technical analysis, if X, then Y. And I think that is the types of things that we want to cover here. And so if different scenario of renewable energy, then what are the impacts? And we have all those impacts listed in different categories. And so there's going to be varying levels of depth we can get into.
Right. Right. So let's keep cranking through these last two columns side by side, which are pretty similar. Environmental Coalition and DPS. So we had T&D on both. So something you're planning to do. Then EJ and land use impacts within and outside of Vermont. So that kind of goes to where you were talking about, Sarah, last night, I think, when you said to what degree we are looking at EJ impacts.
Yeah, in state maps.
Yeah. So that the scope of EJ impacts, are you focused in Vermont alone? Are you looking outside the state?
I don't believe our current scope specifies that. So I don't think it would be probably short-sighted to not acknowledge the impacts that are happening elsewhere.
Okay. Then the next one here is pretty much identical. Impacts on reliability, resilience, and resource adequacy. In your work reviewing IRPs, that feels like right in your wheelhouse entirely. Okay, well, which is probably why it's on your list. New modified procurement tools and alternative definitions of new renewal is on yours and the Environmental Coalition list. Those alternative definitions of new renewables is that another way of talking about clean versus clean, carbon-free, and renewable?
That's part of it, but also the could be the start time of what's new. Do we want new to start in 2025, or do we want to include some things that have happened? You know, we keep it 2015.
I get it.
Do we want to? You know, there's been some talk of what's the term that's been used? Rehoming the RECs from projects like the wind projects in Vermont. All of those get sold out of state. And so do we want to have those here? And in that case, you would have the new regional tier be started in 2010 or 11, right?
Far enough back that you could pick up Sheffield and Lowell.
So that's encompassed.
Okay. The last box other study notes. Targets based on the environmental coalition column, targets based on energy purchases, not retail sales. We talked about that yesterday. Is that something that we would need to be specified in a future law to change the accounting, or that's just where the department is? Actually, that's already in the red, right? How it's calculated.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of this is leading to legislation that, you know, would change the law. So, so total sales versus retail sales would be something that would need to be a legal change, but along with PACE or new alternative.
And then in that lower right box with the bullets in it. So the metrics there, can you, based on energy purchases, not retail sales, okay, fine, that makes sense. And then these bullets are listed here. What are they doing, those bullets there?
These are
Cost
the different,
effectiveness.
the various targets.
This is, yeah, these are things we want to be able to see out of all these scenarios.
Yep.
What are the net costs, you know, the way to say cost effectiveness, and to different, you know, draw the circle in different sizes, societally, Vermont, customer. You know, what's the impact of carbon reduction? How much renewability throughout the year?
Okay. The only thing I see that's different, and maybe you were planning on, we talked about some yesterday, that the DUs are so different, that were you planning scenarios to look at community or co-op as opposed to investor-owned utility, small muni? I don't know how many flavors of utility we're talking about.
So, to be determined. I think what we want out of this is a model, an Excel-based tool that can be modified for each utility. You know, my initial sense is, based on timing and everything, this is still to be determined, is that we will have one statewide model that then can be adjusted by to accommodate analysis for each utility.
Yep.
I don't know that we would be able to get each utility analysis in under the scope, and, you know, because they all have their own embedded resources, they all have their own cost structures, and so.
Is your thought that even if you haven't sort of gamed it out for each DU, that the model would be open enough that someone could take it and plug in their variables and tune them for their DU, and
I hope so.
in a relatively short period of time come back with an answer, as opposed to like another study?
I hope so.
Yes.
Yes. I would like that to be available to, you know, for all the DUs or anybody to say, okay, here's my Wex load, and here's their embedded resources, and here's their cost right now, and here's how it changes if I change the assumptions. That sounds simple when I say it here, but I don't think it's quite as simple as it sounds. So I have a hope for distribution utility specific.
So, think that's the last box. So if I look back at what I've highlighted in yellow as part of the study, it's almost everything on the page. And then I have some things in blue, like a procurement, all those. You've got procurement as well, so it's not even, the only things that were truly unique were like the economic impact analysis, the REMI model. And I had, when we started down this road, I had figured that kind of value stack on net metering, and maybe a standard offer project, because those are the ones that will are part of the in-state energy creation mix would be the ones that might well go through the JFO process. Not necessarily trying to sort it out, so we're not doing something entirely repetitive, but I think I'll be blunter about it. I think the concerns I've heard, like, well, will we get an analysis that fairly values renewable generation in state or in region? Will that analysis accurately or fairly value that source? And so I think the push I sensed was, okay, well, do it through an independent contract. So it's not computing the department, but that was the original request I heard Mason.
Value based on.
Yeah, well, and so I don't want to necessarily say, oh, well, we should both be doing it, or I'm trying to sort out how much we do through the. Watson?
Thank you. Going through this, I have been trying to keep track of like, what are the essential questions that I hope we answer through this? And so I've kind of just been like trying to marinate in all of these ideas and elements of the study. And so I just want to check my thinking about the essential questions that I hope we get to. And open to discussion on any of these, but so on the question of bundling versus unbundling or bundled RECs, right? So what are the CO2 implications, financial implications, and environmental justice implications for bundling RECs to rebundle RECs? Does that make sense? So 3 flavors of impact.
And can you say it again?
Yeah, sure. What are the CO2 cost impacts and environmental justice impacts of rebundling RECs? And I realize that that's
Rebundling.
yes, right. Like for the kinds of RECs that are unbundled right now, if we were to try to bundle them, what would the impacts be? Focusing on just the carbon, what's the most cost-effective way to get actual carbon down, not just in your portfolio, not just like contractually, but like looking at the ISO New England app, like how do we, what is the most cost-effective way to bring down the actual CO2? Focusing on just the environmental justice, what is the environmental justice impact of outsourcing a substantial portion of our generation? And then I'm interested in some value stacks, which I think we might have talked about, but so you know, similar to the Dunsky study that we talked about yesterday. So what is the value stack of net metering differentiated by distribution utility? And what is the value stack for in-state renewables versus what we have now?
That's kind of,
I know that's a,
well, that's kind of what they have. I mean, I feel like that's kind of the scenario evaluation.
do you mean this last part that I'm talking about? Or are you talking about all of it?
I think all of them are kind of somewhat,
Okay.
I think.
Yeah,
But
right.
those are beautiful.
Yeah, well, I mean, I say all of that because I'm trying to ground myself in like, are these things sufficient? Are these questions sufficiently covered? If these are the things that I hope that we get at. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And like, and there's so many different ways to to talk about the different aspects of it. So,
Is it at midnight or noon? Do you ask those questions?
Yeah.
always, all times. I don't know.
Mr. Chair, so the one question that you had your second question, the way you phrased it was really interesting with the rebundling conversation, because I've never really thought about like rebundling or like
Yeah,
going from or bundling.
yeah, ending the unbundling.
Yes,
Yes.
versus like, I don't know. And I could see, I think that gets at what would the rate increases be, which I
Yes.
feel like that would affect the equity of it. You know, if we
Right.
did this and then suddenly rates had to go up because the
Yes.
financial instrument
Yes.
wasn't being able to be used to its full extent.
Mhm.
And then the second would be, where are we then having generation happen outside of our state?
Yes.
That is like, what is the impacts of Hydro-Quebec on? So those are really interesting, but I think that the way I read this scenario planning is it kind of gets at all of those. But
Yeah, under,
I don't know if you can get it. Like, maybe I'm being too thick, but what the answer of this question would be is I think kind of like dependent on how you look at it. Even like if we got, like, I don't know what the answer would be,
Yeah.
and I don't know if there would be oh,
I don't know what the answer is.
Yeah, I
either.
would
be like,
I
how
want
would
to do
you-
this, do
Yeah.
the study, but I think the impacts of outsourcing generation is gonna be, is the hardest one of
Yeah.
those, I think, to answer.
Sure,
So I think
okay.
the, unbundled for, saying that you need to attach all your recs to your energy, you could come up with a cost estimate of that. and
Sure.
say that, and I think that's part of what we would do. And then the environmental costs, I think, is part of it. And then valuing those at the social cost of carbon.
Right, well, and I see that as like a sliding scale. I mean, because just ending unbundled recs would be very expensive, right? But if we were to move the dial on that, like there's gradations, and I don't know how how hard it would be to come up with like, what is that graph? As this increases that, you know what I mean? Like, as you increase this percentage of, required bundled recs, what does that do to overall CO2, to rates, et cetera? Yeah.
Yeah, and how you structure it, it depends on, these scenarios are not necessarily, like, one of these is not necessarily gonna turn into kind of what the law is next year,
Right,
right?
yeah.
So I think they're all just illustrative. And so you could potentially just do that in 1 year and say, hey, if we just,
Could be
said no more
scenario.
unbundling in 2030, what are
Right,
the impacts in 2030 of
Yeah.
that?
right.
And say, oh, okay, that's a big impact. Does that inform how do we want to create a scenario where there's a
Yeah.
sliding scale?
Yeah,
Or does that kind of inform it enough to then, draft, do you create that draft scale, or do you just say, okay, no, we don't want to do that, or yes, we can do it in year one?
yeah,
Right, so, but I do think, out of all those questions, I think most of them are captured that you asked, and the outsourcing generation one is just, I'm not sure exactly, that there could be qualitative, some parts of this may be qualitative,
Mhm.
and
yeah,
that can be informed by the stakeholder group, by the contractor, hopefully, who has some expertise.
So maybe either, I suppose one way to accommodate what you're bringing up could be that you would add it as a scenario,
mhm.
because I don't know if you had anything for any, I don't remember that there was ending the use of unbundled recs within the RES.
I don't think I recall if I don't think that's as explicitly
Yeah.
talked about. And, I think it's more the question that Mr. Serling raised, you know, the one that we want to talk about is what is the core of the issue here? If it's really just HQ, it's like, okay, do we do it from unbundled recs that are imported? Because as Senator White said, I think recs are just the instrument that we use regionally to track compliance. And so if HQ is the real issue, we should focus on that and study that. And because I don't think ending unbundled recs for instance, tier 2 would provide a lot of value.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so,
Yeah. But if the issue is Hydro-Quebec, let's talk about, or large hydro.
right,
Yeah,
yes,
right.
yeah.
Existing large scale hydro.
I think that this is an area where we actually have a fair amount of agreement with the department. I think this report's summary is, it's not, we do away with unbundled recs, but how much new renewables is being brought online, which gets to Senator Watson, your question about the carbon emissions. So
Right.
the tier 1A new regional renewables is part of what that would displace is unbundled HQ recs. If you look at what's currently. So, and those would drive down regional emissions. So, I think your question about when are we physically bringing carbon out of the atmosphere versus when there's a Vermont accounting growth here is the key to that. And then that's, you know, one of the details on, you know, the carbon reduction metric where we'd like to see some additional information. And the department has reached out to us and other environmental groups for feedback on that scope. So we'll be providing that to them. That's one of the key questions.
Yeah. So I'm also trying to listen in terms of like, you know, where would I hope that we could get some depth, and which might be like, even if it's something that's covered by the department, if we're hoping for, you know, I have all the faith that you're going to do a great job. It's kind of like, where do I want to make sure that there's depth, and unless you're like, yeah, no, we'll go deep on this, you know what I mean? And so does that make sense? Like, if
I think
it's a priority, then maybe we should focus on that for our study for depth.
Right.
Because knowing that your scope is really wide.
Well, so that's why I wanted to get to what the real issue was, because I think you know, those core scenarios that we outlined are really where we're going to see a lot of depth. What does it mean if we have, and I'm just picking a number out of the air here, 40% new regional renewable? Well, that automatically means that, you know, 60% of your supply has to come from somewhere else. Already we have 10% in Vermont, and so now we're 50%. And so that kind of, does that answer the question already? And it may get into that depth. Like, the result of that will necessarily be we're buying less from existing renewable resources, whether they're bundled or not. So I don't know, it may be worth a conversation, another conversation, but I feel like we're getting to the core of the issue, and we're going to get to it in depth, but I want to make sure that we're really like hearing your feedback here.
Yeah, well, thank you. I appreciate that. And I also am grateful for just like the back and forth and also like people tolerating my like trying to mesh like what's on the page with like the questions that are, you know, and not this, the questions that I'm coming up with and trying to figure out like, how do these things mesh? So thanks.
You are fast, my dear,
Yeah.
comparatively to.
I don't know, trying to make it work.
I'm very impressed.
Well, so if I go back to what I've highlighted in different colors, the only one that's unique that it's not in the department's study, what depth we're trying to figure out is practical, but Is the REMI,
So just one thing for everybody to know about REMI work in all of these models, how it worked in the pathways report as well. So that initial analysis creates a bunch of outputs, right? Your new load and new costs and new benefits and over time. And those outputs from kind of that initial work then turns into inputs for the REMI model. And then you kind of turn the crank. And the department doesn't have in-house, like I said yesterday, any particular expertise in turning the crank on REMI. We are, we could add that to the contract here, or we could, or JFO could do it, and that would, and they do have expertise in doing that. So,
well, I think, part of what, if the different scenarios are the input to the REMI model, which makes sense. What's a little tricky is if we're not gonna have that data until you finish your work, then, in a way, it seems like we're almost, the REMI, employing someone to use the REMI model before we have the scenarios developed. Seems premature in a way. Am I missing something?
I don't think so. I think the REMI work benefit from the process. Might be worth asking JFO how long they think that kind of thing takes if they have the inputs. But we, because, and then given the timing of it's November and December, and there's all kinds of other budget type work that they're doing, but that would, if it's the same contractor that we're using, then perhaps it happens a little more seamlessly. And there's all kinds of assumptions there, like how much of a solar project that is built in state, how much of the capital cost of that goes to Vermont economic product, right? You got the construction that happens in state, people actually here, but the panels are purchased out of state. And so all of those assumptions need to be worked out also.
Thank you. Well, so considering what's left for a JFO study, I have other things on my list potentially, which includes, we had notes about considering co-location of generation and load.
Yep.
And I'm not sure that maybe I'm wrong, but I didn't necessarily see that come up elsewhere. And I say that because, especially as we were talking about, do we readjust the limits on how big a net metering system could be, understanding that it can be very expensive for different utilities. How does co-location potentially mitigate those costs? So, we've sort of expanded what net metering is defined as. If we can bring it a little closer to the loads, could that be valued differently? Does that?
It's only in our column,
Right.
co-location.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering if,
So
were you doing?
So the way
there was another section here that was T&D costs and impacts and grid cost impacts. So is that your way of defining? That's another way of getting at co-location.
Right, so the way I'm thinking about this is an explicit study, and we would look for the contractor to propose something, study group, but that there's different impacts of different sizes and types of distributed generation that are located, right? And right now, it's been mostly solar that's located. So let's use that as an example. I would think of that we need to analyze different sizes that are procured by the state to meet its in-state target. And so if you have rooftop 5 kW or something, that's been 500 kW or something bigger. And that seems like another step for like a scenario analysis. And then that would ultimately, the benefits and costs would change, right? A bigger project is cheaper, but it may not have the benefits of being sited next to load. And so that all could be fleshed out.
As a part of the TMD.
It's really the value stack and like it kind of the scenarios with the T&D impacts. You know, the T&D is one of the impacts.
But it seems to me you'd have to break that out as its own separate value stack. You know, like solar, as there's so many factors there, like size of solar relative to load proximity.
So in that Dunsky study, and it's been a while since I've looked at it, but they show results from like different types of net metering projects.
Okay.
Right. And so I think
you could do
still have
something.
one chart that would be similar.
Okay.
Am I correct in characterizing the Dunsky study?
I think that's accurate. It's been a while since I've looked at that as well.
Okay.
Anything else? We're gonna have the secretary at 11, just trying to make sure we will break before we. Anything else on here? Doesn't seem like it's yet covered.
Well, just just coming back to the variety of opportunities with storage and seeing if we can, get closer to what might be a policy recommendation, or should we have a policy recommendation around storage? So, and then so that's another thing that I flagged, and then also and again, maybe this is covered. We've sort of been talking about the possibility of a potential new tier 1A type of generation. And I know you had sort of talked about that as like potential, but it was just not necessarily super clear to me that was, on your list of like, should we, create such a new category?
Yeah, it's definitely, that one's a called out scenario, right?
Oh, okay.
It's a new regional. And
There's scenario 3 on your paper from yesterday.
Adding a new requirement for utilities to purchase renewable energy from new facilities in New England. Oh, okay. Okay. And so thank you.
so we didn't specify the percentage in the draft. We could do that, or we could add, for the scope, or we could do that as part of the process.
Bracketed, whatever. Not necessarily naming just one scenario, one outcome, but I know.
Right.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, so we're not at a tiny place. And sometimes that's the nature of trying to figure things out. But I think what I propose is that two things. One, as time allows, members of the committee might want to work on distilling this into what would the JF, I think, for me that honestly, at the place where, other than the REMI work, I'm not seeing that many things that we've identified that were on our discussion list that aren't actually part of the performance students. And then it makes me think, if the REMI work is the unique contribution of what JFO usually brings into the then okay, that's good to know. But when do we use that tool? If we haven't done scenarios, how do you know what you're doing? Sort of a GDP impact for. Like if you were going to do GDP impacts, REMI impacts, it would seem like you would run them against the scenarios that we just were walking through, 1 through 6. I don't think actually we still fleshed out 5 and 6. That seems like something that needs to happen in sequence, not in parallel.
Yes.
And that's just sort of, it seems like the, whatever, the challenge of the fact that, we're trying to push ourselves along, maybe by doing processing in parallel, but it may not be a practical approach at the moment. So I would say, let's mull it over. I'm going to try to loop back to committee members today, since we're all here mulling this over, and see if before end of day, we could come to some tentative conclusions. So that we need drafting,
Okay,
that
so,
we could get Ellen drafted
Okay.
later today, to have something to look at tomorrow.
well,
All right.
Mr. Chair, I'm really comfortable with what I believe our discussion has led to at this point, which is continuing on the path of having the Public Service Department do the majority of the work that they're already endeavoring to do, with the understanding that we've talked about the trust and the stakeholders who would need to be engaged in making sure that they're a part of the conversation in a very robust way, so that we're not starting with assumptions that lead to outcomes that don't reflect the needs of the developers of renewable energy or those who are in the environmental justice population, which is the correct terminology I learned last time. And I also agree with you that the REMI work should be what JFO does. And I would be comfortable, just so you can save yourself a conversation, I would be comfortable if you wanted to have that sequenced in a timeline after the scenarios are done. I think the stakeholder engagement, we didn't spend a lot of time talking about, but I think that's actually what would resolve some of the differences in what people are looking for, is just having the ability to comment or be a part of the process as they're being developed. So that's kind of where I am.
That's the same, in here.
Yeah.
Third one.
I am holding all of this in my head together with, like, I'm not really knowing what the house is doing.
Yeah.
And so I'm interested to see, I don't know what their timeline is.
I think they're using today as their day to figure out what. I think that was full stream. My understanding is they have a string of witnesses, and they're gonna crank right through the res in a day. And I honestly don't know
Yeah.
what will come up the other end.
Okay, well, and I am also feeling a little unsettled and want to just like hold it open-handedly right now and chew on it a little bit.
Yeah, same here. I mean, I
Okay.
think it's, I want to make sure we don't fall into the whole thing. If we only, as legislators, the only tool we have is a hammer, so everything starts to look like a nail. It's like, oh, well, we need to write a bill, and we need to do something. And it may be that what the department's doing actually is addressing the vast majority of what we're looking for information on. And so then I just wouldn't want us to say, well, we have to do something or we haven't done something. The department's already doing something. And,
I think my concern is that the scope is very broad.
Yeah.
And what deservedly so, there's a lot of questions. And so I'm trying to consider, is there other places of depth that would not be bad to dig into? And so anyway, that's part of my
independently dig
Yes,
into it
yeah.
through the like
Right.
JFO work.
Yeah.
Per se. Okay. Yeah, I'm game.
And,
All right.
and seeing that hopefully as a complementary thing, if there can be work that the department would feel comfortable offloading to a JFO study. And if not, that's okay, but it's just, again, part of my trying to weigh it all.
Sit with it,
Yeah.
figure it out.
Yeah.
Okay. Same here.
Yeah.
So, but I'll check back in. So if you can mull and do floor and afternoon committee and flight all at the same time, we'll we'll keep the conversation going. We'll have some time tomorrow morning to come back. I mean, maybe that's probably a more realistic thing, that by the time we reconvene tomorrow morning, people will chat with it and maybe we'll have a little more clarity on how to sort out what we do versus food department versus JFO. Okay. So with that, I'd like to just